welcome to today's webinar, From Classroom to Finishing Program, Communication Skills for Effective Driver Training, a webinar brought to you by the Professional Truck Driver Institute and the Truckload Carriers Association. I am Habib Ahmadi, Education Project Coordinator for Truckload Carriers Association, and as a reminder, today's webinar is being recorded. At this time, please take a moment to answer a polling question and let us know how many participants are viewing this program at your location. If you have a question for today's presenters or team during the Q&A session, click on the Raise Hand tab located at the top left side of your screen. This will let us know that you have a question, and when your turn comes up, I will introduce you by the name that was typed in when you logged on and give you instructions on how to open your line. If you're using a speakerphone, please use the handset to ask your question to eliminate any background noise and to make sure your question is heard clearly. After your question has been answered, click on the lower hand tab so we know that your question has been answered. You may also ask a question at any time during the program via the text chat. To do so, type your question in the box located at the bottom left-hand side of the screen and then click Send. We will acknowledge receiving your question once it has been received. If you should accidentally disconnect during today's call, just dial back in, re-enter your PIN number, and you will be immediately reconnected to the program. Dave Heller, PTDI's director, will now make some introductions. Welcome to the program, Dave.
Thank you, Habib, and good afternoon. PTDI and TCA are pleased to bring you this webinar with the educational and technical expertise, time, and support of Truckload Carriers Association's Education Department. Thank you, Habib and Ron. The ability to communicate effectively to trainees is an important skill for instructors and driver trainers. It ensures new drivers acquire the skills and knowledge they need to be successful. This webinar will help you understand nonverbal communication clues and how they reinforce or contradict verbal communication, as well as learn techniques for improving listening skills and reinforcing desired behavior. Our presenter today is Ron Good, Director of Education for Truckload Carriers Association, where he has been developing training and education programs for the trucking industry for the past 4 years. Before joining TCA, Ron was the Director of Education for the American Staffing Association. Prior to that, he was the Associate Director of Education for the National Association of Federal Credit Unions. Ron earned his Master's of Education from George Mason University, where he specialized in adult education and distance training. Ron?
Thank you so much, Dave, and thank you everybody for joining us this morning, afternoon, or whatever time it happens to be in your time zone. We really appreciate your attendance at this important webinar. And also, as Dave mentioned, I am TCA's Director of Education. I'm Ron Good. And I would like to thank Cengage Learning for their support of this program. The content from this program came from their training manual, that Train the Trainer. So we really want to thank them for allowing us to use that material for our webinar today. I would like to take a moment to introduce our driver training expert will be joining me today as we explore the do's and don'ts, ins and outs, and best practices of communication skills as they relate to driver training or finishing. First is Rob Banke. He is the Department Chair for Fox Valley Technical College in Appleton, Wisconsin. Rob, why don't you tell our audience a little bit about Fox Valley Technical College?
Good morning, everybody. As Ron has mentioned, my name is Rob Banke. Our program here typically graduates approximately 800 entry-level drivers per year. We have a number of different programs available for our students, and we also do a number of contract work with leading industry partners as well. So thanks for having me on the call.
Great. Thank you so much, Rob, for sharing that with us. Next is Larry Fishman. He's the campus president for Allstate Career in Baltimore, Maryland. Larry, can you tell us a little bit about Allstate Career?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Larry Fishman. I'm the campus president at Allstate. And Allstate's one of the largest truck driving schools in the country. Currently, we have about 26 trucks operating with 400 or so students. And in addition to that, we operate trades and allied health courses as well. I've been in education now coming up on my 33rd year next month. And it's just a pleasure to work with guys young and old that are attempting to learn how to drive to get out over the road. It's a very unique group of individuals, highly motivated and very willing to go to any lengths to succeed, and it's a great group to work with. And pleasure to be here today with you guys.
Great. Thank you, Larry. We like your enthusiasm as well as Rob's. And finally, but not leastly, is Harry Kimball. He's the Vice President of Risk Management for Western Flyer Express in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, one of my favorite cities. Harry, tell us a little bit about Western Flyer Express.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Western Flyer Express is a 48-state carrier operating inside the continental U.S. As you said, my name's Harry Kimball. I've got 38 years in the business and appreciate the opportunity to be here today to help in any way I can and learn from y'all as well.
Thank you, Harry, and we look forward to hearing more from you about your driver finishing program and practices that you do. It's always good. I know we have a lot of carriers on the call, and I'm sure they like to hear what you're doing. So we look forward to that. So I want to welcome and thank all of our speakers. And now that you know a little bit about us, it's our turn to find out a little bit about you. So we have another polling question we'd like you to answer for us. If you could please indicate which type of organization you work for. And wow, I'm not surprised at what I see coming in, that the majority, well, almost, most of you are with a carrier, but almost the same number with a private school, which is good. We were hoping for a balance like this. Very few carrier schools, and we have some publicly funded schools, but a lot more private schools. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. I'm sure you guys, everyone on the call can see what our audience looks like. But, yeah, well, look at that. Before I could hit share results, the private schools edged out the carriers. But, the fact that we have so many carriers and so many of you on the call is an indication of how important this topic is. And as far as, what I see in the industry, driver training and driver finishing is the beginning of the retention process. And right now our industry needs lots of drivers. So whichever ones we can get through the school, once we get them into finishing, to keep them on board, is going to be important for our industry as well as for your organizations, as I'm sure all of you are aware, which is why you're on this call. So let's go ahead and get started with our presentation, and let's talk about improving listening skills. Listening skills are important to a trainer or driver finisher in many ways, but one of the things that I found really interesting about this is that trainers need to also help their students develop good listening skills so that the transfer of learning happens more quickly or better. Because if you're communicating well but they're not listening well, and we're going to find out later on in this webinar the dynamics of that, then the message is not going to get to them what it is you're trying to convey. So not only do you have to become good listeners yourself and develop good listening skills yourself, you have to help your students develop them. So this is your opportunity to learn how to do that as well. Good mentors or good teachers are good listeners. And there is a difference between hearing and listening. Many people think because they say, I hear you, that it means that they're actually listening, but many times it is not. Hearing is an involuntary physical act that happens just because your eardrum picks up sound. And whether you want to hear it or not, it vibrates in your head, and it sends a signal that your brain is able to translate into some kind of communication, whether you're conscious of it or unconscious of it. So it's a very voluntary physical act, whereas listening takes effort. It takes concentration. I know for myself, and I have to, when I am mentoring someone or when I am training someone and trying to listen to their feedback, I have to focus my entire being on that person only because I am not an auditory person. I'm not an auditory learner. I'm actually more visual. And I have a very short attention span. I am very impatient, and I don't know how many of you know me if we met in person, and maybe you can tell from the way I'm talking now, I'm like a squirrel on caffeine. So I have this high energy. So I don't have a lot of patience, and so sometimes, I know times when I've actually been looking at someone, staring them right in the eye, and completely left my body. And so I have to concentrate to really listen to what that person is saying. And I think that is an important part of this. This is one of the most important parts of good communication skills is our ability to do that. And I think, Rob, you had some comments you wanted to make about this as well that I'd like for you to share right now.
Sure. Thank you, Ron. You know, as far as the good mentors and teachers, just a comment that I had made earlier in our other discussions here is just as an instructor, I found myself sometimes where you're too busy teaching. You know, we're full of this knowledge and information, and we just want to pour it upon our students and our customers, and you know, a lot of times we just have to take some time to be that listener. You know, and as far as mentoring staff, have to lead by example and remind them that, you know, there's a time to promote listening, and so we ourselves have to do that. And in regards to hearing and listening is something I also share with our staff and even the students is we think of hearing as observing an action, and then listening is more of the application or the processing towards a result. So there is quite a difference between the two.
Very good point. Thank you very much. And, you know, to just follow up a little bit on what you just said, the research shows that typically people spend 80% of their waking hours in some type of communication process, and that 80% is split 50-50 between speaking and listening. So half of the time they're listening, but for driver trainees, they spend a large majority of their time listening to other people, like 60 or 70%. So, you know, as a trainer, being aware of how we're communicating to them and being able to listen to them when they do get the opportunity to respond is important because it helps the transfer of learning happen. It ensures that it happens. That's why good communication skills are important, and your point was very valid in that regard. So thank you so much for that. Also, listening actually has three additional parts other than the hearing part of it. It's the interpretation. Interpretation leads to our understanding or sometimes misunderstanding. Sometimes we misunderstand what someone's talking to us, and it could be not just a verbal cue, it could also be a nonverbal cue that we misunderstand. But we're going to talk about that, nonverbal cues a little later as well. The next step is evaluation. So you interpret something, and then you consider what it is that you've heard, and then you evaluate, how am I going to use this? How am I going to use my interpretation of what I've just heard or what I just experienced to respond, which is the next thing, is reaction and responding. So then you react to all of this data so far. You decide how you're going to react, and then you react. And like I said, sometimes interpretations can be misunderstood, so that means the response is going to be incorrect for the situation. Good listening includes, so in a nutshell, good listening is an analysis of what was heard, and it's the verbal and nonverbal feedback or reaction that we take as a result of that, of what we've heard and how we've interpreted it. So understanding that process really helps us understand where our students are coming from and how they interpret, how they might be reacting to what we are providing them with. So now I want to find out if you are a good listener. So I want you to answer these next 4 polling questions very honestly, and you'll be able to see what your colleagues, where they consider themselves at the same time. So think about this. Do you try to see the problem as the speaker sees it? So when you're communicating with someone and they're talking to you, do you see the problem as the speaker sees it? Yes, if you do it 75 to 100% of the time. Sometimes, if it's 50 to 74% of the time, and no, if it's less than 49%, it's 49% or less. And be honest. And it looks like most of you are in the middle, which is understandable. You do it sometimes. It looks like our responses are slowing down, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. Everybody can see where they are, how they relate to their colleagues. So like I said, the majority do it some of the time. So hopefully at the end of this webinar, all of this will improve and you'll be able to say yes. Next question. Are you interested in the speaker as a person? So that individual, are you interested in them as a person, as your student? yes, sometimes, or no? Oh, this is good. I'm glad to see this. I know you can't see the results right now. Oh, yes, you can. All right. So you see that most of you say yes in answer to this question. So that shows your commitment and belief in what you do. That's good. That's probably, of the four, I think one of the most important traits to have. If you're interested in a student, it really helps. And so there you have the results right there, which I'm sure you've already been able to see. All right, next question. Do you listen willingly? Are you forced to do it? Do you have to force yourself to do it? Like I said, I like a squirrel on caffeine. I move real fast, and sometimes I have to force myself to stop and listen. I'm also a storyteller, which you might find out is true as we go through this webinar, and so storytellers have a hard time listening to other people's stories. So I know that's a struggle for me. So I'd probably be somewhere in the middle, but it looks like, again, the majority of you say that you do, that yes is your answer, and the next majority would be, sometime. That's good. That's telling about our audience. This is good to see. All right, our final question on this topic is the final one. Can you remain calm even though the speaker may be angry and excited? And I personally, most of the time, I think I could say yes to this one myself, because I think I am able to do that. I do have a short temper, but I've learned to temper my temper at appropriate times. So I think I would say yes, and it looks like the majority of you feel the same way. So these are, and I'm going to go ahead and close this poll and show you everybody see the results. So these are just a few of the questions that you can ask yourself to rate whether you're a good listener or not. The full list is published in the Cengage Learning Manual, Train the Trainer, that I talked about earlier, was provided courtesy of them, and it can be downloaded from the URL that you use to download copies of the PowerPoint slides, so that you'll see a link to get the full list. And I really encourage you to do what I did when I saw it, was I went through and honestly rated myself and decided where I needed to improve. So thank you so much for your participation in that. Let's move on to improving good listening, good listening guidelines. Number one, stop talking. And you probably figured from what I've said so far that that's probably one that I have to focus on the most. Show you want to listen. Use nonverbal signals that you really want to listen. Establish eye contact with the person. Focus your attention. Focus on key words, main ideas, and visual images. Try to see the other person's perspective. And many of you answer that you do in the polling question, that you do that. Be patient. Take the time to listen. Give them that opportunity. Hold your temper. We already talked about that. And one of the things I found interesting in my career as a trainer and also as an education professional is that the failure to understand can be caused as much by poor listening as by poor speaking. In other words, in the communication process, as many of you probably learned in your freshman year of college or probably high school, is that a communication process has a sender, a message, and a receiver. If any one of those fail, then the communication process breaks apart. Well, it can be as much on the receiver side as it can be on the sender side when that happens. So that means good listening is really important here. And Rob, I'm going to call on you once again. You made some interesting comments about this yourself from your own experience. Thought maybe you might want to share any of that right now.
Sure. Thanks, Ron. Regardless whether it's the classroom or possibly on the range, even in the truck, for example, in the classroom, a lot of times you find yourself busy and there's just a lot of activity going on and you're communicating with your students. One of the things I try myself and I share with our staff, make sure that we're facing the student. When a student is talking to us, we want to make sure that we're making that eye contact, we're facing the student. Even out on the range, we use a radio system If I'm identifying with that truck, I'm talking to them on the radio, I want to look at that truck to make sure that they understand that they have my full attention. And then obviously with safety in mind, of course, but even when we're in the truck and we're communicating, whether it's we're pulled over to the side of the road or however, just making sure I'm turning, my body, and I'm again giving my full attention to that individual. And then just that last bullet point is, holding your temper and your judgment. So many times, again, with the amount of knowledge that we all have as a part of this industry, sometimes we're quick to judge an individual, and we have to remember that we're there to educate and to train and to mentor those individuals. And so a lot of times, internally, I just have to remind myself, hold your judgment, allow the conversation to continue, and we have to learn through this. So just a few comments on this slide here. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Excellent point. And Harry, we talked, briefly just before we got started, and you mentioned to me that you not only train drivers, but you also train trainers. So I'm sure a lot of this resonates well with you. Is there anything you would like to add?
Well, one thing I would like to add is the fact that when you're in the teaching environment, the perception of the classroom and the person that is speaking to you, all eyes are on you just like your eyes should be on them. So it's very important that you take the time to acknowledge this person's questions or the statements that they're making. And instead of, it's real easy in like he said, with our kind of experience to think I've heard it all before and I've heard this before, but it's the first time these students are hearing it. So it's important that it be just as important to us as it is to them, and we present it that way.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Harry. So we'll move on. I'm sorry, yeah.
Hey, Ron, it's Larry. I just wanted to jump in here for 1 second.
Oh, Larry, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to leave you out. Go right ahead,
Sorry,
sir.
Man. I just want to slam an exclamation point behind that stop talking, because as instructors, at least for me, sometimes we fall in love with the sound of our own voice. And it's important, especially with our audience, to drink from a frothy cup of shut up once in a while and give them a chance to organize their thoughts and ask questions. Sometimes a few seconds of silence is golden. You'll get a question, or they'll process something you said and turn around, and the whole level of the lesson or the environment goes up because they've had a chance to process and think. So I have to fight against that urge to fill every silent space. Sometimes a silent space is good.
Yeah, no, and you raised a very good point. As a matter of fact, one of our participants on the webinar just sent in a comment. Joel said, I believe all these listening skills are also important from a manager standpoint, making a new or prospective driver feel valued and important. So no matter whether it's a trainee or in a training situation or after they've been hired and they're starting to work for you, I agree with Joel 100%. And it backs up everything everyone has just said, how important listening is. And like you said, taking the time to stop talking, which is like the last point. It started, the list began and ended with stop talking. So very good points from everyone. Thank you. So moving on, don't judge. That was self-explanatory. The minute you judge, you block any means of feeling compassion or concern for that person. The minute you start to judge them. Don't argue. And that goes back to the temper. The whole idea of holding your temper, because you get into an argument, your temper is going to flare up. And there's usually because of your temper that the argument flares up in the first place. But, just avoid that. At that point, no communication is happening on the listener side or on the student side. They're just trying to make their point to you. So no matter what you say, is it really going to, when you get into a heated argument, no matter what you say, because it's all emotion at that point, they're not going to hear any of it. Ask questions. That shows your attention, that you're really listening well. Use active listening skills. And these are really good points right here that came out of the manual. Rephrase or paraphrase by restating the main idea or content. And we already talked about, focusing on main ideas and, key words. So that goes hand in hand with if you're focusing on them, you're able to rephrase them back to make sure you understand what they're saying correctly in your own words, in your way, and then they can acknowledge that. Ask questions for clarity. Ask them, do I have this right? After you rephrase it, did I get this right? And take notes. Don't do it too much. Take notes only on important points, on main points, key words, that kind of thing, not on everything they say. then it kind of looks like an inquisition or something, or you spend so much time writing, you're not really paying attention to them. And then the last one happens again is stop talking. And Larry, you also had some, great comments about this part of the presentation I'd like you to share right now too. You talked about mirroring, and I thought that was an interesting statement.
Well, it's a key point of active listening. Sometimes the best thing you can do is be a mirror to the person who's speaking to you. Just reflect back what they said. Sometimes repeat it back to them exactly, word for word, what they just said. In your own mind, that may sound or feel stupid, but it's amazing how it validates the speaker, how it validates for them that you heard what they said and that you're actually participating in the conversation, that you haven't zoned out. It's important not to overdo it. You got to reserve it for the key ideas. When you're in an important conversation, or if somebody's frustrated because they don't think you understand what they're talking about, that's a perfect time to turn into a mirror. Just repeat back exactly what they said so that they know you're listening and they know that you got it. And a lot of times they'll confirm, yeah, that's what I said. And now everybody knows they're on the same page.
Excellent point. Thank you so much. And Rob, I want to come back to you too. When we were talking about judge, you had some interesting perspectives to share on that I thought would be good for everyone to hear.
Thanks. First, Larry, I'm going to write that down. I like that. I'm going to share that with our staff, that mirroring, and so I appreciate those comments. Just going back to the judging, whether an individual, a student, or a customer has made a comment, or even by appearance, sometimes whether it's students making contact or judgment discussion points in regards to other students, or making comments towards another individual, or maybe even you catch a staff member unfortunately mentioning a few things. We can't judge an individual based upon their appearance, their gender, their race, financial status, those types of things. Everybody, we just have to take everybody for who they are and value them as individuals and grow them. One of the things that I share with our staff is that we are to provide an education so that our students can make choices. So let's not judge. Let's start with that clean slate. So just a few comments there.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Rob. Harry, is there anything you want to add before we move on?
Well, yeah, one of the statements here is don't argue. And, even though the information that's coming across might not be you may know it not to be correct, still give the respect to the person to explain to him in detail where the one-on-one person can understand it, instead of arguing in front of a classroom in front of a bunch of people, because that's going to be distracting to everyone in the room, and you're going to lose your validity if you do that.
Excellent point. Thank you very much. All right, let's move on. So let's talk about bad listening habits and and the ones that we should avoid. Making assumptions. That goes back a little bit to judging, which is the next point, judging or criticizing. Reacting before hearing everything. Sometimes in a situation, a learning situation, especially if you're under pressure for time or you're under pressure for whatever reason, things aren't going quite the way you want, there are times when you just start to hear someone's comment and make a judgment or an assumption right away before you've heard the complete statement. And that's happened to me many times when I've gone to explain something and the person was really impatient and didn't hear me out and completely misinterpreted what my intent was. And sometimes those lead to arguments. So it's important to just take the patience, take the time to listen before you react. And don't assume that even though you do know what they're going to say, that it's automatically a bad idea. At least let them explain their perspective on it. Focusing on minor points and missing the major one, it's like being nettlesome or nitpicky, and that would drive anybody absolutely nuts. Taking notes on everything. I talked about that when I said, take notes is a good active listening skill, but taking notes on everything is not, and I mentioned that already, why it's not, because it looks like they're at an inquisition, you're writing down everything they say and do, or you're just writing and not really paying attention to them. Pretend to listen when you are not. That that is really an insult. And that was one of the ones that they pointed out is please don't do that because you can misinterpret. Your response could be incorrect based on your misinterpretation. So if you don't know or you don't understand, ask them. Be honest about it. Don't pretend that you do. Remaining silent when the speaker is unclear or incomplete in expressing thought. So sometimes you do have to give them the opportunity, especially older learners need a little bit more time to complete a thought. But when you see that they're struggling with that and it's clear that they're struggling and unclear, help them out. Paraphrase a little bit for them, based on what you're hearing so that they know that you are listening, that you are there. And don't just be silent and look at them like you don't understand what they're saying or they're speaking another language. So I wanted to, Rob, you really had a lot to say about this kind of, bad habits. And so, again, I'm coming back to you for any thoughts that you have.
I appreciate that. And I'm also watching the comments here on the webinar. I think there's a lot of this has to do with this this distractions that we have. I guess I'll just sum it up with I think that a lot of times I have to fight this in my own nature here is to not try to finish someone's sentences, allow them to complete the conversation, complete their thoughts, and grow on that conversation from there. But so many times I have a tendency to jump to an assumption that I know exactly where they're going or exactly what they're going to say because we've been there, we've heard it before, but we can't make those assumptions and we can't try to finish their sentences here. But anyway, just a lot of distractions and a lot of things going on, as you mentioned, Ron. We just have to be patient, very patient.
Exactly. Thank you. Patience is a virtue. It's also a skill. Yes. So we'll move on. Another bad, habit not to do is tuning out. Like I said, I've looked at people and completely left my body and was in another state or something, and they were talking to me, and it looked like I was paying attention. So I have to really focus not to do that. And we talked about this already, letting prejudices or preconceived notions block receptivity. And I found it really interesting, Larry, what you had to say about this whole idea of tuning out. And you talked about using gestures and that kind of thing and facial expressions. And it's good because it relates to the real situation in a cab when a lot of your communication with the trainee is driving or, it's talking. They're driving, so you're talking to them. So they can't really look at you and see everything that you're doing, but some things that they can pick up on. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to comment on this, especially on the tuning out part. I thought it was interesting what you had to say.
Yeah, well, this works for training trainers as well as for working with the students. But, I mean, we all know, all trainers in this industry know that one of the basics is, especially when students are practicing backing skills, when an instructor's alongside a truck, the instructor's supposed to have his hand on the truck at arm's length. And the safety thing behind that is to keep them from getting their foot run over. They're the right distance from the truck. But for me, it's more than that. When I'm watching my instructors on the range all the time, I'm looking to see that hand is out on the truck because for me, it's a sign that they're paying attention, that they're engaged. Because when they take their hand down and just walking alongside the truck, they could be a million miles away. When that hand's on the truck, I know they're engaged. And it's the same way in a conversation. If I'm talking to someone, a lot of times I'm watching their nonverbal cues to see if they're paying attention. Are they working with their hands when they're talking to me? What are their facial expressions? Or are they, out thinking about the shopping list? And I know from experience that our students especially are watching the same way. They're watching for any opportunity to say, you're not paying attention to me. So it's key to use your hands and your face in the conversation. Now, if you generally never do that, I'm not saying be fake. You have to be genuine and be who you are. But if you occasionally use your hands in your conversation, it's a good thing to do that, to let people know you're paying attention. Mm-hmm. It's just like that hand on the truck. That's how I know whether my instructor's engaged or not. And it's something fundamental to teaching, and it should be something fundamental to communication.
Very good. Thank you so much. And Harry, you also had an interesting perspective on this that I'd like you to share with the audience as well.
Yeah, and my point was that, while you're out there in front of the classroom, they're watching everything you're doing. And if you don't show the interest in there or interested in what they've got to say, they're going to drift off or they're going to pull back. I've explained this to my trainers as well, is that when they're out talking to these people and listening to them, listen to them, don't listen at them. Bring in everything they've got to say, keep the tone moderate, and understand that everything coming back and forth between trainer and student is important, regardless if we feel like at times it is or not.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, both of you, for your comments. We're going to move on to keep pace with our time schedule here. Then we're going to talk a little bit about nonverbal communication. 90% of meaning in communication is derived from nonverbal. Body language accounts for 55% of the meaning in communication. Isn't that interesting? In nonverbal communication, 55% your body language. Tone and voice account for 35% of meaning. People pay the most attention to the other person's body during the communication process. So your words must match your actions. When they don't, for both you and the learner, when they don't, that means something. It means that there's something off. If they're saying one thing or you're saying one thing but reacting differently, your body language says something else, it's a sign of insincerity. There's something that is being hidden that you need to pay attention to. Some of the nonverbal, when we talk about nonverbal responses and how they must match in the communication process, we look at, how is the person looking at us, their eye contact with us, or how we're looking at them when we're talking to them. Facial expression. This is important because the facial expression can show whether the person's happy or angry or sad or disgusted or surprised. Gestures. What are they doing? We learn in studying this material that gestures are important, especially in a training environment, because the driver can always, look directly at you, but they can kind of get an idea of what your if you're using gestures, what they mean out of the kind of their peripheral vision in that regard. And when you're talking to them face to face, are you showing interest? Are your gestures, are your hand movements, or the way you nod your head in line with what you're saying, or the intent that you're trying to convey to them in terms of listening to them? Voice and tone. This one is really important, especially in the cab, because like I said, the driver cannot turn and look at you if he's driving. He should be looking at the highway. But he can tell from the tone of your voice and how you're talking to them what your intention is. It's a nonverbal way of communicating. Even though you're talking, it's still a nonverbal cue. And the same is, what you get back for them. And so anyway, I thought that one comment that you made, Rob, about nonverbal responses was interesting. And I like this because what you said was, this can be damaging if we laugh when we should have cried. And I thought that is a point to make. That is a different way of looking at this. So not only should the nonverbal communication or the reaction match your intent, it should also match the situation. It shouldn't be out of sync with the situation. Like you said, you laughed at something when the person was being really serious. I didn't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
Thanks, Ron. I think you said it really well. It kind of goes back to what Harry mentioned before, is having an individual pull back, if our reaction is not matching the conversation. How many times have we been in engaging conversations and we get to a certain point in the conversation and someone is shaking their head yes when we know, in fact, it probably should be a no? So just be very careful, because this brings emotions into the picture as well. And like Harry said, having an individual pull back just a little bit. So just be cautious of those moments.
Excellent. Thank you very much. This other concept is the consistency of nonverbal communication with the action. And this sort of consistency, like I said, the two have to match. But there's another kind of consistency, and that is overall, based on research, over all personality types and age ranges and whatever kind of demographic you want to think about, certain actions indicate certain things that a person is communicating to you. And so that's what this this is about, is consistent. So if you see these kinds of actions or nonverbal responses, they actually indicate something, and they're consistent. You're not misreading. So in other words, boredom. If the person is stretching or looking away or looking at their watch or folding their arms or simply just sitting laid back, or if you're doing it, that means you're bored, and that's pretty consistent. And again, this consistency also means that if you're trying to communicate to the learner, to your driver that you're training, your trainee, that you're listening to them, but your nonverbal cue is boredom, they're going to be confused because they're not matching. The other is vocal cue. Often this indicates, if you have a monotone or if that a monotone voice kind of makes the person feel like it means that you're bored. It's very consistent. Most people that use, some people just naturally have a monotone voice. I don't think I'm one of them. So if I'm ever talking to one of you and I suddenly become monotone, it probably means I'm bored, and I apologize in advance for that. But most people are that way, that their voice, when you get excited, it modulates. It has a different tone. Another thing to think about is if there's abrupt speech or some kind of reaction abruptly, like a movement or something, that means that they're agitated or irritated by something. And it often means that they're being defensive, that they're irritated or agitated by you, and it's a sign of defensiveness. It could also be a sign of discomfort. And then their body position. This provides clues. Again, I talked about folding your arms. If they're folded and the person looks really stiff, that means something. Their body position is important. It is pretty consistent when people do that. Unless it's really cold where you are, they're sitting stiff with their arms folded. They're blocking you out, and you need to look at those clues. Or if you're doing it, that means to them you're blocking them out. I didn't know if Harry or Rob or Larry, if there was anything from your experience that you wanted to share here about this last point on nonverbal communication.
This is Harry. I'd like to add this. Sighing inside the class, whether it be from the student or whether it be from the person presenting, is a sure sign. People taking deep breaths, rubbing their eyes, almost laying down in the seat that they're sitting on, looking at their hands or rubbing their fingers. That is a sure sign that this person is not in touch with what training is going on. Mm-hmm. And what I try to do, and I have my trainers do, stop at that point and focus on this individual and bring them back into the classroom environment, whether it be through questions, whether it be through bringing your voice up to make it more excitable, where they'll pay attention, because there's key factors in this that has led this employee to that. Either your voice is getting mundane or it's getting repetitious in their eyes, so we may have to pick up our speed a little bit, but focus on this one person, get him back in line or her back in line with the classroom, and then you can continue the teaching experience.
Very good. Excellent point. Thank you so very much. Anybody else?
I think this is Rob. Great point there. Along those same lines is, if we see we're up there and we're communicating, we're instructing, we're educating, and we have some students. Sometimes I've seen a nonverbal. It's where they'd roll their eyes and intentions of maybe they feel that they've heard it before, that like you mentioned before, that they're bored, and to try to bring them back into the conversation. But one thing that I've also noticed is sometimes that's been a distraction for me, and it actually sometimes allows me to lose focus, and it takes that teaching moment down to a lower level. And unfortunately, that affects the whole group. And so we have to be very careful with that and how we receive some of those nonverbal communication pieces, so that it does not, take the conversation to a lower level. We want to keep that very positive. So those are some things that I've seen in the classroom environment.
Great. Thank you very much, Rob. And we'll move on. Then we're going to talk about reinforcing desired behavior. Research shows the following 4 guidelines must be present for learning to take place. In other words, for the transfer of learning to happen. The subject matter must be presented at the learner's level. The subject matter must be presented in a logical sequence. Now, there's especially these 2 points really talk about some really good instructional design theory that we don't have any time at all today for me to go into. And perhaps in a follow-up webinar we'll talk about instructional design and what are good design techniques and good delivery techniques and that kind of thing. But suffice it to say that different tasks, different learning tasks take different levels of cognitive ability for all people. For example, it takes less cognitive ability to memorize your alphabet or memorize your numbers, but it takes a little more to be able to tell an alphabet from a number, and it takes a little more to be able to define what an alphabet is and to define what a number is. So each of these, and each one builds on the other. So in the learning process, when you're training somebody, you have to think about where they are. What knowledge do they know? Where do you want them to go? And what are the levels of cognitive ability they need to reach to get there? In other words, what are the things that they need to learn to get to the point where you want them to be? And then that's the order you teach. The sequence is important. The other thing, which I think happens most frequently in this type of training environment, is that when we're training, we train in a sequence that makes sense in terms of how the process happens. You know, what is the first step? What is the second step? Many times, really good drivers, and this is why it's important to really select your driver trainers well, because sometimes the best drivers don't always make the best trainers. And in that process, you know, because you understand something so well, when you go to teach someone else, you may forget a couple steps that you learned along the way because you already know how to do it. So you just have to remember to break it down a little bit more to the level where that person is and follow the sequence in an order that makes sense. And Rob, you also had a couple comments that you wanted to make about this whole, especially the idea of the subject matter being presented at the learner's level. I'd like for you to share right now.
Yeah, just real quickly, Ron. Again, what works for one doesn't necessarily work for everybody, and so we have to keep that in mind at all times, both as we're teaching and as we're listening, to keep their expectations, their skill sets, and their learning styles in mind at all times. And then just for reinforcement, what have you, is always to remember to keep that in a positive manner.
That's right. Excellent.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then the other, and I'm going to speed the process up a little bit because I promise Larry and Harry you'll have more opportunities later, but I want to keep moving because I want to give time for Q&A. Then the other two points were learner knows when he or she is making correct or incorrect responses, and reinforcement, which plays back to number 3. Reinforcement must be given as the learner gets closer to the defined goals. In the training in training, reinforcement techniques provide feedback to the learners to ensure that the desired behavior and to ensure that the desired behavior happens and to minimize or eliminate undesired behavior. And that's what we're going to start to talk about. So reinforcement must take place after the learner makes the first contact with the learning, not before. So it must take place after they try something, after they try to shift the gear, after they try to back up a truck or whatever it is. It has to happen right after that. And it must be reinforced shortly after it happens, like within seconds. There shouldn't be too much of a delay between when the action is taken and when the reinforcement happens. Other things to consider. The most useful and effective type of reinforcement is positive reinforcement. And it's the one that you should use most of the time. And it's any action that encourages the desired behavior, the behavior that you're looking for. It is used to reward correct behavior immediately after it happens. Trainers should arrange training situations so that learners seek rewards, so that they want the reward of doing something correctly. And rewards can be things like special privileges, personal approval, or learning outcomes. Now, I have to make a note here. The reward should be something that the learner thinks is valuable, not something that you think is valuable. And I think, this would be a great point right here, I think, Harry, where you could probably, from your experience, add a little color to this, or a little, example from your own, training situations if you would like to.
We reinforce this behavior not only in students but in our regular drivers as well, in many, many different ways. Most of it, I feel like, is the acknowledgement, where you go to the student, you tell him he's done a good job, you do it in front of people, you make sure that other folks see that that you're recognizing a good situation, because they in turn are going to want the same thing. It doesn't always have to be monetarily.
Mm-hmm.
It's just as important, a good pat on the back in front of somebody saying, that's the way it's done.
That's right.
And these students beam with that, and they want more of it, and the others want to be in the same group that they're in.
Very good point. Excellent point. Thank you very much. So we'll keep moving. Words you can use include yes, good, excellent, continue. Phrases include fine answer, that's clever, good response, a good way of putting it. Now, some of these words and phrases might seem awkward to you, or they might not be natural to you as a trainer, or maybe they seem awkward in this situation. The idea here is to develop a repertoire of phrases or actions or cues that you can use so that you can give this positive reinforcement to the right learner in the right situation, which means you need to know your learners. You need to take the time to understand, who your learners are, their personality, what makes them tick, what encourages them, and what does not. And so these are all really good phrases you can use, but don't feel bad if you feel awkward about some of them. They're not natural to you. Find the ones that are natural to you that will also fit the situation. Then there are nonverbal expressions of positive reinforcement, such as looking at the learner, smiling, shaking the learner's hand, circling motion with the hands to encourage the learner to continue. I like that one. It says that, yeah, you're on the right track. Keep it up. Other actions include asking the learner to explain something to others. The great thing about this is, with adults especially, the minute you take the time to teach somebody else something, you learn it better yourself. So that's always a good practice to make, is ask one of the students to teach something to another student or to the whole class. But you do that as a reward because they've got it. They figured it out. Using the learner to model the correct performance. If you're doing role play or something like that, or use their example, that makes them feel good. Wow, I did something correctly. Asking the learner to participate in a demonstration. It goes back to the first point a little bit. And awarding points towards some kind of reward. And remember, the reward should be something that the learner thinks is valuable, not something that you think is valuable. Negative reinforcement. Okay, we got to talk about this a little bit. Negative reinforcement is any action taken immediately after the act that discourages repetition of an undesirable behavior. And it's usually something that the learner does not want. I want to caution you, it should be used sparingly, because negative reinforcement can be really damaging to the learning process and to the students' morale and to all the students in the class. So there are times when it's appropriate, but most likely positive reinforcement is what you're going to use. Its purpose is to discourage the act preceded by the reinforcement. Kind of the opposite of positive is to encourage the act that preceded it. It must be used sparingly. And there are times when, like I said, you may need to do it, but you use it sparingly because it could be damaging. And when you do it, please couple it or follow it with positive reinforcement. Say, yeah, you didn't get this right, and this is what you did wrong. However, I was inspired that you thought of this. Then the two are together, so they don't feel like you're just coming down on them. I'm sorry. And I think I've already covered these points. It's a form of punishment that can impair a trainer's effectiveness. Mild negative reinforcement may spur learners on to greater efforts, however. So like I said, please use it, sparingly. Acceptable phrases. Now, there are unacceptable phrases of negative reinforcement. One of them would be, "That's the dumbest thing I ever heard," or "That's a dumb question." So those are not good. Or looking at someone so strongly or sternly out of disapproval, or looking away like you're disgusted, looking disgusted. Those are unacceptable forms of negative reinforcement. But here are some that are acceptable when you can use it. That's not exactly correct. You need to think that through again. Incorrect. You can do better than that. Or unsatisfactory. Those are okay. And Rob, I just want to come back to you real quickly. You added one of your own that I thought was interesting. I thought it would be good for you to share right now if you could.
Sure. The comment that I had mentioned is I haven't heard or seen that before. Show me how that correlates to what I've said. And whether it's in a classroom on the range or out on the road, it's just an opportunity for an individual to explain their process, their thinking, through that process. So I just wanted to share that with you. I've used that a number of times before.
Great. Thank you. And then acceptable nonverbal expressions includes looking disappointed. It's okay to look a little disappointed. Shaking your head, meaning that that they're not on the right track, or frowning a little bit. Just don't look so mean. Other acceptable actions include stopping the instruction and quietly staring at the learner, especially if they're doing something disruptive. Like I said, you wouldn't use it if they're really trying to do their best to do something correctly, don't do that then. But if they're disrupting the class somehow, I think, in that case it's okay. Or you withdraw a desired privilege from them, or you give them a poor assessment. And those are pretty self-explanatory. And then we're going to go to our last point, which is extinguishing behavior. And you use this when there is a behavior that you want the learner to stop doing. This is considered a no reinforcement type of reinforcement. There's none, and it includes just ignoring the behavior altogether. And the idea is that it will minimize or completely eliminate the behavior that you don't want. Maybe they have an unsafe practice that they have a habit that you're trying to get them out of, something like that. And that's when you would use this kind of extinguishing behavior. And the best way to do that sometimes is ignoring it to the point that you stop reacting to it. They stop doing it. And the learner may consider it a type of punishment and may stop trying to do it altogether. If you do this, they'll see your reaction as a type of punishment and stop trying to do the undesired behavior altogether. So that brings us up to our first Q&A break, and I know we ran over just a little bit, but we do want to take some time to answer any questions that may have come in. So Habib, I think everyone understands how to ask questions at this point. I don't think you need to do that, but let me know if we have any raised hands, or Dave, if we have any text questions.
We do, Ron. We do have a couple text questions that come in, and I do want to address those first. Right now, we don't have any raised hands, but we do have some text questions that we can start going through.
Okay.
Let's get to the first question. Basically says, what about channeling the student to self-talk as part of the communication process, getting them to take an active role in self-teaching? Instructors guide the self-talk to take place. What about those options? Are they out there, and how do you address those?
Wow, so it sounds like that's a very good question. I'll take a stab at this. It sounds like what the person is asking is about helping the student become self-aware or self-motivated on their own, that they take the time to engage in some kind of self-directed learning is what they call it in the adult education world. And you can encourage that. There's many ways you can do it. I don't have time to go into a lot of the theory, but I think in most cases in this situation, one of the greatest ways to do it is find out what the student's interest is in terms of the curriculum of the program. What is their strong point? What is the thing that gets them excited or that they do the best? And then ask them, give them some kind of assignment to explain that to the rest of the class, to require them to do a little bit more research on it. Or it could be something that they have a weakness in, an area that they're weak, and you want them to strengthen it. You could do the same thing. You could say, hey, I want you, you're really good at this. You're really good at this part of it. Why don't you, look into how do you do this, and then come back tomorrow and show the class. And then maybe have everybody do that. Maybe have some kind of self-study. Pick a topic that they like and that they're struggling with, and ask them to, explain why it's tough for them, and then ask them, based on what they looked up, what was inspiring to them, what they learned. And they'll find, I think that'll encourage them to do a lot of exploration on their own, if I'm understanding the question correctly. But in this particular situation, I'd like to defer to one of our driver trainers. I mean, I answered it from the adult education, and me as an educator and trainer, I've never trained truck drivers, so I don't know, Harry or Larry or Rob, if one of you want to add your perspective. Okay, very good. Uh-huh. All right. Go ahead, Dave. Anything else?
We do have an interesting question here, and Ron, you can probably address it and then get out to the carriers and schools too, because I'd like their opinion as well. There's some schools on here that deal a lot with students that have language barriers, which is interesting. And how can they effectively overcome this barrier, which is interesting because you do have to be able to understand and communicate in the English language, but there's still effectively a language barrier there. How can schools overcome this?
Man, that is, and that is actually a very good question, and it's one that's not unique to driver training. It happens in all realms of society where people are trying to learn and better themselves. And, a couple of the things that I've seen happen is instructors encouraging students to take a SOL class or, a EOL class rather, English as a second language class, in part-time to help them understand. The other thing that I've seen done that I think could help is a little one-on-one time with that student. If they knew enough to get that, if they knew enough of the language to get to that part, it may, to get that far, they may just need a little more support one-on-one to help them understand difficult concepts or ideas. And so if the trainer has time to do that, that's another avenue. And then, the one more obvious one, is there a bilingual person in the class that you can pair that student up with that can help translate some of this for them is, another thing that you can look. And there are a lot of people who are bilingual, a lot of English-speaking people who understand another language enough to be able to communicate with another person and sort of, mentor them, even live during the class. Those are my thoughts. I didn't know if Larry, Rob, or Harry had anything based on their experience.
Yeah, I got two things on this. Sorry, this is Larry. Two things on this. One is the buddying system. We definitely use that. Two is we have a couple of instructors on staff who are bilingual that we make available for tutoring and a little extra help. And the third thing we do is we make up a sheet of terms, particular technical terms to the driving industry that they're going to have to learn the English term no matter what. And we try to put equivalents in another language as close as we can, or at least some keywords in another language that will help them figure it out. And we give that out fairly early in the training so that they have a long time to work with that.
Excellent. I like those tips. Anybody else?
This is Rob. Again, just use your resources the best that you can. We have an ELL program. It's called ELL Truck, so it's an introductory. But it goes beyond that as well. We, whether it's students, maybe they can't read, maybe they can't comprehend. So there's a multiple structure here that we have to deal with continuously. But just use your resources that you have.
Okay, thank you. All right, Dave. I know we ran over time, but people are still on the call, so we'll take a few more questions.
We do have a few more in the queue here, and I do want to get to them. In this line of work, and this is the trucking industry, so people like to tell stories, and that's instructors and drivers alike. You guys on the call, you guys leading the conversation. What suggestions do you have to keep people on point?
I could jump in on this one. This is and that is a problem when your trainer would much rather talk about his last 35 years of driving than the case in point. And in our industry, it's prone for that. What we do is when we're instructing our trainers, we set out a program that they're to follow step by step all the way through the process. And we are in and out of the classroom ourselves, making sure that we are staying in line. And I think that's very, very important, because nobody wants to sit in there and listen all day to old war stories. The first one may be entertaining. After a while, you're there to get a message, and you're not going to get a message from someone doing that. We monitor that ourselves. We follow our course program. It's timed. Everything is just in the processing days that we use. Everything has to remain on schedule for the schedule to work. So we monitor that within ourselves to ensure that doesn't happen.
That's a good point. This is Rob. We do the same, and we just explain that to the groups, whether the students or the customers, and we explain that there's curriculum that needs to be taught and there's a time frame that it needs to be taught within, and there will be times for stories, but there's also time for teaching. So we just be upfront with the folks.
Well, those are good answers. We finally have one last question, and this is good because we ran over, so this will be the last one of the day. Any ideas that you guys use to assist students and memorize certain routines, such as, say, a pre-trip inspection or a 4-point break process that they use for their CDL test? Do you guys have any tricks on that?
Yeah, this is Larry. We have two things. We have a set sequence that we use for the pre-trips. We give it out in a little demonstration and then in the notes, and I can make that available, if anybody wants to email me for it. But the other thing, we had a student a couple of years back who made a rap video on doing a pre-trip, all in rhyme. It's amazing, and we got his permission to use it, and we show it to every class, and some students don't relate to it at all, but a lot do, and you find them using the rhyme from the rap to do the pre-trip. It works phenomenal.
Yeah, that's a good point. This is Rob. We've created a video for our students, so they have it in format, in hand format. And then also, obviously, we give them plenty of time to practice. Sometimes it's using a student, the buddy system, and having a couple students, and I think you have that conversation with students, what works best for other students, and I think you'll find out that students are going to arrive at something that works best for them. But we have created a video for that as well, so that's just another way of learning.
Well, thank you, guys. I appreciate it. And at this point, I'm going to hand it back over to Habib, who's going to close everything out. Thank you all for attending, and we do appreciate it.
Thank you, Dave.
This concludes today's webinar, From Classroom to Finishing Program, Communication Skills for Effective Driver Training, brought to you by the Professional Truck Driver Institute and Truckload Carriers Association. Many thanks to Ron Good, Rob Benke, Larry Fishman, and Harry Kimball for their presentation. For more information, please contact Marlene Nikita at PTDI. If we did not get to your text questions, we will pass them on and get a response back to you. When the webinar is closed, you will be redirected to an online program evaluation form. Please take a moment to fill it out. Your feedback is important to us and will help us with future webinars. Thank you for joining us. You may disconnect now.
Subconferencing is now active.
Hello?
Hey. This is Harry.
Hey, Harry, it's Larry. Well, that was fun.
After this many years, I still actually love it. So I don't know if I'm the one with the problem or...
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, did they leave us, or?
I don't know. I'll give them another minute or two.
Yeah.
I got something at 1:30, but I can hang out for a couple of minutes.
Well, yeah, still there. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get off.
All right, Harry, you have a good one.
You too. Bye.
Thank you. Please stand by.